Donald Trump always boasts that during his past administration, the United States did not enter into any war. He hasn't been the only one. It didn't happen in Joe Biden's time either. Still, there's one part of Trump's speech that has changed slightly. The president keeps talking about peace, except for one field where he does talk openly about war. Of course, it's not a war like the one we all have in mind. Check it out.
Our country is being poisoned from within by the drugs and by all of the other crime that's taking place. The drug cartels are waging war in America, and it's now time for America to wage war on the cartels.
The United States against drug trafficking. This is the next war that seems to be looming for Uncle Sam. I'm sure you already know that for Trump, narcotics are closely linked to a lack of security, immigration, and the problems that the United States has on its southern border. And in a way, it's true. Drug trafficking and cartels are directly related to crime, lack of security, and all the problems generated by the massive presence of drugs on the streets. This is something that I believe no one can deny. Nor can we forget that in the last 5 years alone, nearly 450,000 people have died of drug overdoses in the United States. To put this in perspective, this figure is 7 times greater than the number of Americans killed during the 20 years of the Vietnam War. So there is clearly a problem. In numbers of casualties, this problem is already far more serious than virtually any war Washington has fought, which is precisely why Trump has decided to treat it as such.
Every foreign gang member will be expelled, and I will immediately designate the cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. We're going to do it immediately.
And as we say around here, no sooner said than done. Just after arriving at the White House, the president has signed a host of executive orders of all kinds. Well, one of them was to fulfill that very promise. With this order you see on the screen, the new president has begun the process of declaring the major international cartels as terrorist groups. Particularly, he talks about all the Mexican cartels, and also the Aragua Train or the Mara Salvatrucha.
The cartels functionally control, through a campaign of assassination, terror, rape, and brute force, nearly all illegal traffic across the southern border of the United States. In certain portions of Mexico, they function as quasi-governmental entities, controlling nearly all aspects of society. The cartel's activities threaten the safety of the American people, the security of the United States, and the stability of the international order.
In other words, from now on, Mexican narcos, for instance, will be on the same level for Washington as ISIS or Al-Qaeda, with all that this implies. VisualPolitik community, we may be facing an unprecedented escalation. And it is exactly at this point that we ask a number of questions. Can Trump really declare the cartels as terrorist groups? What would it mean if he did? And what exactly would such a war look like? Could the US intervene militarily in other countries like Mexico, as it has done with ISIS or Al-Qaeda in Syria and Iraq? Well, that's what we're going to look at. Fire up your engines and let's get started. Many of you may be thinking, let's see, equating ISIS with the Jalisco cartel sounds weird, doesn't it? Well, let's give it a spin. Imagine you're playing a game of comparing villains in a movie. On the one hand, you have the extremists who go all or nothing to impose their worldview. On the other hand, you have the drug lords, the king of illicit business. Well, both groups kidnap, murder, and commit terrible savagery, and both groups control strategic territories in order to carry out their operations. These are the similarities. Of course, on the other hand, there are also differences. Groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda have a political and religious objective. Meanwhile, narco groups have a different agenda. Theirs is business, the greenback, the control of the narcotics market. That is the crux of the matter. Well, this is where Donald Trump comes in. What he says in the background is something like this. Guys, I don't care if you have political or economic ambitions. I don't give a damn. ISIS and narcos are external threats to US security. Period. No frills and no beating around the bush.
When I am president, it will be the policy of the United States to take down the cartels, just as we took down ISIS and the ISIS caliphate. We have to be tough, we have to be smart, we have to be fair.
In principle, it doesn't appear that Trump is going to have a problem getting this initiative off the ground by declaring the narcos to be terrorist groups, as he has requested by executive order. And he should have no problems, basically because he has a powerful tool at his disposal, the Immigration and Nationality Act. With it, he only needs Marco Rubio, his Secretary of State, following his instructions, to sign a notice to Congress. And with the Republican Party dominating both houses, the path is more than clear. And so, once this process is concluded, which I tell you shouldn't take long, Trump will be able to implement all the executive powers that the United States designed after one of the darkest days in its history, September 11th. VisualPolitik community, we're talking about a huge legal arsenal that gives great powers to the government and that emerged precisely after the attacks against the Twin Towers. After that tragic day, Congress passed Public Law 107-40. With it, the president has full ability to use appropriate force against any organization planning or executing terrorist attacks against the United States. It is practically a carte blanche that Trump will now be able to use to fight the cartels. Let me say it again. They will be in the same category as Al-Qaeda or ISIS. But what does this mean in practice? Well, basically, two things. In practical terms, this will give Trump a kind of war powers against the narcos. If he wants to, he will be able to go for their throats with the full military and political power of the United States of America. Sounds shocking, yes, but here comes the million-dollar question. Why didn't he do it before? Was the situation between 2016 and 2020 not so serious? Well, it's not that he didn't have the idea in his head. It's just that at that time, in 2019 to be exact, his own advisors told him, "Hey Donald, slow down a little. This is not as straightforward as it seems." At that time, his advisors considered that there were too many loopholes, too many problems for executing such an order, and even diplomatic consequences that could blow up like a ticking time bomb. For example, if he wanted to, he would have the power to bomb regions of Mexico in order to attack the infrastructure of the cartels.
The president pulls me aside on at least a couple of occasions and suggests that maybe we have the US military shoot missiles into Mexico to go after the cartels. At that moment, I knew I got to write the story, because at least I have one witness who will verify that this really did happen.
At the time, the US president stepped on the brake pedal, but now the new Trump has arrived refreshed, with much firmer ideas and full of energy. Of course, what Trump does or doesn't do is always surrounded by huge uncertainty. But no, this time it doesn't look like anything is going to stand in the way of his plans, whatever they may be. In any case, what seems clear is that we can expect an escalation in pressure from Washington. Take this guy for instance, Mike Waltz, Trump's national security advisor, has been working for years on the idea of establishing narco groups as terrorists in order to expand military pressure against them.
We need to go on the offensive against them. I plan to introduce legislation to authorize the use of military force against these cartels.
And not only him, other figures such as Kristi Noem, Trump's Secretary of Homeland Security, also advocates an extremely hard line against narco groups.
If we cannot stop the flow of drugs and the movement of this activity on federal lands that are under federal jurisdiction, something is very wrong with our current system.
And take note, because both Waltz and Noem are two of the most influential voices for Trump on security issues. But the question is, would an all-out drug war strategy work? Well, let's take a look. Certain doubts arise here. A military-level war against the narco groups is no trifling matter. This is not like moving a few chess pieces on a board. We're talking about international interventions with enormous challenges, starting with the very governments of those countries. But could it work nonetheless? Well, these are Trump's plans. Listen up.
Narco war.
Let me ask you a question. Do you remember the War on Terror? The war on terrorism launched by the United States, along with several allied countries following the 9/11 attacks. One of the difficulties they encountered was the absence of a state actor, because facing off against a country is not the same as facing a dispersed organization, with much more informal structures scattered and hidden in countless places. Well, the United States could face the same challenge if it decides to launch an open war against Mexican cartels, or those of other countries in the South American continent. Therefore, the first crucial aspect will be to define the level of participation of the armed forces in this conflict. Will they form an international coalition with the armies of Mexico and other allied countries? Will they opt for tactical strikes using special forces? Or will we see the Marines raiding the homes of the Sinaloa cartel? Well, possibly. But it may also look nothing like that. This war may not be as direct as we might imagine.
I want to be clear, I'm not talking about US troops. I'm talking about cyber, drones, intelligence assets, naval assets. We've done this before, back in the 80s when the cartels in Colombia were shooting down planes.
All indications are that the plan is for the US military to recognize the narco groups as being at war with the country, but without engaging in direct combat with them. Thus, the idea they seem to be working on is to use drones to carry out highly focused attacks against plantations, laboratories, warehouses, airstrips, etc., as well as intensively expanding aerial and maritime surveillance of the entire southern border. And pay attention, because this last point is not a minor one. Back in his first administration, the Republican president made a similar bet. Look at this.
These forces represent a 65% increase in ships and a 75% increase in surveillance aircraft from last year alone. We're taking the fight directly to the sinister criminal cartels, and we're showing them No mercy, I will deploy all necessary military assets, including the U.S. Navy, to impose the full naval embargo on the cartels. I did that before and it worked.
VisualPolitik community, the fact that Trump focuses so much on the sea and air in this fight against the narco groups and not so much on the land border is not at all a coincidence. Take a look at this graphic. As you can see, in recent years, drug seizures at US borders have dropped quite a bit. For Democrats, this is a true reflection of a much more secure border. The drug traffickers no longer dare to bring as many drugs into the country as they did a few years ago. For many Republicans, however, these figures mean something very different. That drug traffickers have found new ways to outwit the authorities. In this case, the crux of the matter could be in maritime seizures, which have grown by 50% since 2019, and today account for the largest share of the total. This is precisely why Trump now wants to attack the narco groups not only on the high seas, but also in their own production and distribution centers. Well, as you can imagine, this has not gone down very well with governments like Mexico's. Take a look.
México es un país libre, soberano, independiente, y no aceptamos injerencismos en nuestro país. Es colaboración, es coordinación, pero no es subordinación.
The Mexican president initially reacted badly to the new US leader's comments, trying to make it clear that she would not allow military operations on Mexican soil. But guess what? As the days went by, the tone changed. Sheinbaum and Trump spoke on the phone, and after several conversations between the teams of both, the Mexican government began to say that, well, yes, they are willing to collaborate with Trump.
Y vamos a colaborar y entendernos con el gobierno del presidente Trump, estoy segura de ello, defendiendo nuestra soberanía como país libre, independiente, soberano, y colaborando en todo lo que podamos colaborar.
We don't know whether this has come about due to her own decisions or because Sheinbaum has no other choice than possibly allowing US military operations against the cartels. And in exchange, Washington commits to much tighter controls on the entry of weapons into Mexico from its own territory. According to the Mexican president, 75% of the weapons arriving in Mexico come from the United States. This could be a realistic win-win deal for both governments. Trump would have his attacks on the cartels, which are certain to be very popular in the United States, and Sheinbaum? Well, she could say that she's also leading this campaign and that she's disarming the criminals. And by the way, she has managed to free Mexico from the said tariffs. Because I reckon that if the Mexican government approves of the United States doing and undoing things in its territory, at least they won't be punished with tariffs. It's the least he could do, don't you think? But hold on a minute, because right here we come to one of the great weaknesses of Trump's plan. Whether we like it or not, these days, and at least on this issue, Mexico is not a reliable partner. In this country, the narco world is protected from the highest political spheres. For instance, there are serious suspicions that Mexico's current Secretary of Security and Civilian Protection, Omar Garcia Harfuch, has connections with the cartels, as did many of his predecessors. And the truth, we believe that destruction of the narco groups will not occur until Mexican politics is completely cleaned up. In the end, precedent tells us that no matter how much assistance and intelligence the United States can offer, this is not a problem of resources, but of will. And perhaps that's why this time, Trump has decided to take the bull by the horns and have US troops lead the operations. No more half measures. And the Republican team seems to be turning to a precedent that they say proves this strategy can work. Which country do you think we're referring to? Well, none other than Colombia. Waltz and Trump are convinced that following Bogotá's example in its fight against Colombian guerrillas and bloodthirsty cartels like the Medellin cartel is a good idea. Now, what exactly are we talking about? Could there be a sort of Plan Colombia 2.0 for Mexico? Well, let's take a look.
No need to reinvent the wheel.
VisualPolitik community, in the 1990s, Colombia was a real bloodbath. The country was suffering a perfect storm between the armed conflict with the guerrillas and the proliferation of drug cartels everywhere. If you have seen TV series like Narcos or Pablo Escobar, The Drug Lord, or movies like Barry Seal, I'm sure you already have an idea of how things were.
But the light at the end of the tunnel came in 1999 when Bogotá and Washington signed the famous Plan Colombia, an agreement for peace and the strengthening of the state. Thanks to this plan, Colombia became one of the largest recipients of US foreign military financing. During the first decade of the 21st century, Uncle Sam allocated nearly $9 billion in military aid to Colombia. At the time, the country was second only to Israel as the top recipient of Uncle Sam's military support.
Along with all that money came ground and aerial surveillance equipment, strike teams, and intense training to combat both guerrillas and narco groups. As a result, by 2012, a large part of the territories controlled by the FARC had been recovered and drug trafficking activity was greatly reduced. It's not that Colombia is a garden of roses these days, but compared to the Colombia of the 1990s, it's a totally different world. Bogota, for example, is one of the most vibrant cities in the entire Hispanic world, a definite must-see. But that's another story. The point is that this plan we're telling you about is being widely cited by Trump's entourage. The problem is that they seem to be overlooking the fact that there's already a plan in place that, although far from being like the Colombian one, also establishes close cooperation between the two countries. I am, of course, talking about the Maritime initiative, which, to tell the truth, given the current situation, doesn't exactly seem to be working. In its beginnings back in 2008, the idea was that this collaboration would reach the level of Plan Colombia. In fact, the United States went so far as to transfer helicopters, maritime patrol aircraft, satellite tracking equipment, and a whole arsenal of assault weapons to the Mexican army. However, as of today, the situation is as follows. What can I say? While 3 decades ago, Colombia far surpassed Mexico's homicide rate, now it's the country of mariachis and rancheras that has taken the lead, something that seemed unthinkable not so long ago. And the difference between Colombia and Mexico is that in Colombia politics, civilian authorities and military commanders took the fight against guerrillas and cartels seriously. In Mexico, on the other hand, this has not entirely been the case. Of course, let's take a moment, because if we're really talking about defeating the narco trade, we can't only talk about Mexico. We also have to look at the United States itself. For example, in 2023, almost 9 out of 10 people convicted of fentanyl trafficking were US citizens. In other words, the war on drugs is also being waged at home. So if the Trump team really wants to take this problem seriously, they're going to have to take very serious internal measures, from controlling pharmaceutical groups to prosecuting money laundering and distribution networks. And then there's the age-old dilemma. Who's in charge of reducing demand? Even if Trump were to strike hard and even destroy most of the Mexican cartel's capacity with an intervention, many experts believe the business would just be rebuilt in just a few weeks. For example, narcotics produced in clandestine laboratories in China, or even in Canada and India, are already beginning to make their way onto US streets. And that's without mentioning drugs with other origins in Latin America. Be that as it may, it seems that this time the new president wants to change the rules of the game and start hitting the cartels hard. If you are the most powerful country in the world, how are you going to allow a group of criminals to take the piss out of you? Well, here on VisualPolitik, we're going to be following this issue very closely, and we'll tell you everything that happens. But until that time, it's your turn. Do you think Trump's idea of involving the military against the cartels can work? What do you think Mexico will eventually do? Leave us your thoughts in the comments. And very important, if you like this video, hit the like button and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. As always, thank you very much for being there. All the best. See you next time.